Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. Happy summer. We made it finally. Hopefully everybody is in a place that is not super smoky. I'm in Alberta, and so there's been days. It's been pretty bad here. So I'm wishing everyone clear air. So most of you know me. My name is Alison Mostowich. I'm the Director of Engagement with Efficiency Canada. I'm in Calgary, Alberta, which is home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and the Métis Nation of Region 3, as well as all the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. And I will also mention that we are a remote workplace. So our offices are in Carleton University, which is located in the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. So before we get started, just a reminder to everybody that the presentation will run about 20-ish minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions after that, but you're welcome to put your questions as they come up for you in the Q&A box at the bottom. You can like those questions, and that makes sure they get asked a little bit sooner. So if you hit the like button, it's a little bit like upvoting questions. So today I am very pleased to welcome Brian Flanagan, who is the Executive Director of the Building Decarbonization, and he is here to tell us what it's all about. So Brian, I will hand it over to you. Thank you.
All right, and thank you so much. I'm also coming from Ottawa, where Carleton is, in the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I'll share my screen. Hopefully that will work reasonably well. There we go. Can you guys see that okay?
Yep, looks great.
Perfect. All right, as Alison said, I'm the Executive Director of the Building Decarbonization Alliance, and I'm really thrilled to be able to provide this information for you. We're at our early stages of development, and so getting the information out about what we're about and what we're trying to do is very important at this stage. And I wanted to just acknowledge the amazing collaboration that we've got with Efficiency Canada in helping to get the message out. And as you'll see later, they're deeply involved in our steering committee and things like that. Without further ado, let's get into it. My deck runs a little bit long. My pace might be a little bit quick. There's a lot that I want to get through, so bear with me if I'm going a little bit fast. So our primary mission and raison d'etre is really to accelerate electrification in our buildings in Canada. Obviously, we need to get going. We're way behind on that front in terms of reaching our 2050 net zero targets. I'm assuming that this audience really understands the dynamics and the depth of kind of how far we are behind in reducing the emissions that we have in our building sector. So I won't get into that too much. But it's important also to recognize that in terms of our vision, it's not just electrify at all cost. We know that we have to be mindful of climate adaptation with the way that our climate is affecting us visibly every day, as Alison was mentioning, with the air quality issues and with heat, or in where I am in Ottawa, we're often getting ice storms now. And it's really important that we recognize that we have to do this right. We only have a couple of chances before 2050 to renovate buildings as we build them out. So it's important to do it in that way, and not to forget the question of affordability and the possibility of having renoviction and gentrification as we move forward in renovating buildings and the cost of utilities and these things. So we're very concerned about this as a multifaceted issue. It's important to note that we're creating an alliance of industry. So we're not a trade association, we're not a member-driven organization. Really what we're trying to do is to create an alliance of all of the leaders who have a shared interest in moving forward on the file of electrification as a pathway to decarbonizing the end uses, the heating end uses of our buildings. And the intent is to really create an alignment of those interests so that we can accelerate the market. And that would include builders, developers, architects and engineers, academia, manufacturers, the labor movement, banking and finance. And we're really intending to come into the space with great humility, because there's so much activity already happening in the space, as you all know, and working with partners like Efficiency Canada in a complementary way, and others like the Climate Institute or the Pemmican Institute, who are already doing really good work in this space. But our approach is a little bit different in the sense that we are trying to build that cross-sector ecosystem approach to bring all the voices together and then work to leverage that over time to advance the file. And our scope is intended to be the whole building sector as a subsector of the economy. And that would include residential, commercial, new construction, as well as existing buildings. So we are an initiative of the Transition Accelerator. If you guys aren't familiar with the Transition Accelerator's work, I would really encourage you to go to that website and have a peek. There's a lot of theory around market transformation that is hatched at the Transition Accelerator. And the slide here describes this idea of moving from critical analysis into practical action. And at the very end, it says spin out industry-led consortium projects. That's us. They've gone through this process, looking across the various sectors of the economy to try to understand sort of what are the most promising pathways to decarbonize for the whole of the economy, and including the building sector as well. So I'd encourage you to have a look there to see that work in pathway development. But at the heart of it, I guess I can simplify things and say that the pathway decision-making framework is based on an idea of finding credible, capable, and compelling pathways to get us to net zero. And this is important because we're operating in a very constrained environment where labor is constrained. Obviously, it's a big topic of conversation around the availability and shortage of labor that we have. It's tremendous economic opportunity, but it's also an amazing challenge. Financial resources that are required to bring about this transition are limited. And most importantly, time is limited. So we don't want to waste your time pursuing avenues that are not really going to get us to a net zero future. And so this diagram shows you we don't want to spend our time going up this small summit only to realize it's a false summit and have to come back down and go back up. Another way I look at it is think about it as a maze. And there's a lot of dead ends potentially that we could go down, and we don't want to do that. And at a high level, the Transition Accelerator has gone through an exercise using a pathway decision-making support tool to assess the degree to which various avenues are credible, capable, and compelling. I know you guys can't read this, but I encourage you to go to the website and get a copy of this. And essentially what we found is that two things are very certain. We have to go a lot faster. At our current rate, it'll take 150 years to retrofit all the homes. That's not going to be appropriate. And we also have come to conclude that electrification is really going to be where it's at for the vast majority of facilities in terms of decarbonizing the heating and cooling, or the heating and hot water end uses. That's not to say that there won't be other solutions. Renewable natural gas and hydrogen will certainly have a place in the ecosystem in harder to decarbonize regions, or where there are other economic activities that are taking place, like transportation hubs and things like that. And others are advocating for advancements in those technologies, and that's fine. Our contention is that even if those are wildly successful, the vast majority of buildings are going to have to be retrofitted to heat pumps, and new construction really should include heat pumps. And so we're really focused on electrification as that most promising pathway to get us to where we need to go. So that's kind of what we're all about. We, again, as I mentioned, with some humility, our goal is to eventually become the voice for this idea that the building sector really needs to electrify its heating end uses. We're modeled on industry alliances that have formed elsewhere, notably regionally in British Columbia. The Building 2 Electrification Coalition is an amazing organization that's part of our steering and advisory committee, as well as the Building Decarbonization Coalition in California, who does great work promoting these decarbonization concepts using an industry alliance sort of approach. And so we aim to accelerate market transformation in this regard. And the way that we do that is basically through four kind of primary mechanisms. The first is really convening industry, as I mentioned, bringing together all the members as a cross-section of the entire ecosystem to really facilitate knowledge transfer and aligning voices and amplifying successes and those kinds of things. We'll also be undertaking primary research and working with others in the space to try to coordinate and collaborate on research so that we can really identify where gaps are in our knowledge and understanding, and to help advance this in ways that might go quicker than they otherwise would. Of course, a big part of the objective is to advocate for the right policies. Decision makers at all orders of government are really grappling with how to do this in the best ways. And again, using a pathways approach to make sure that we're not sub-optimizing the process and getting there as quickly as possible. And increasing awareness. There's a lot of information out there that may be out of date about heat pumps and about their performance, or about how we get there and what the appropriate timing is and all these kinds of things. And we want to really work to increase awareness on that on an evidence-based approach and with the best and latest available information. We intend to really sort of advance that market transformation idea primarily by engaging with the sector. As I mentioned, this full representation of the ecosystem. And the way that we want to do that is basically through a couple of mechanisms, really amplifying the successes that we see out there. There's a tremendous amount of work that's happening, as you are probably aware of some of it, where we're seeing decisions being made on new developments. We're seeing lots of interesting retrofit activity where we've got great successes with fully electrified buildings. And so we really want to amplify those successes, or new and innovative sort of approaches, startups that are providing heating as a service with geothermal systems and things like that. So we really want to amplify that and let people know that this is something that's possible and that it's already happening in large measure. And as well as just transferring knowledge among participants in the ecosystem, particularly across different subsectors, learning about what the banking and financing industry is working on and how data and how they're looking to decarbonize their portfolios and how that relates to what a builder may need or what a developer may be looking for. So it's really trying to cross-pollinate and share knowledge. At the end of the day, though, the intent after having built out the sort of ecosystem for some period of time is to really cause decision makers and leaders at various orders of government to see an alignment of voices that the industry is ready to move forward on this file, that we're encouraging leadership and encouraging policy decisions that advance the transition. And of course, in any market transformation, there's the way that it was and there's the way that it's going to be. And folks that are holding on to the way that it was have lots of information to put in the space, and we want to make sure that we're countering that information with information about this most promising pathway to get us to where we need to go. So at a high level, this is what we're trying to get done, but in practical ways, there's lots of initiatives that we have underway right now that are examples of what it looks like to be engaging with the sector. The first, hopefully some of you will have seen it. We released our position paper yesterday that sort of outlines the case for electrification of our building end uses. We're pretty proud of that work. It's a collection of what we know so far. It's not the authoritative be all and end all. It's intended to create dialogue and to invite people into the space to engage with us on an evidence-based approach. So if people have different ideas or different evidence that suggests that our research can be improved or that we need to correct some of the positions, the intent of that paper is to do that. And we're reaching into all kinds of other networks. This is an example of us reaching into a network. Efficiency Canada has done great work over the years to collect its allies. And we've got other networks that we're working to collaborate with as well to extend our reach and to build out the ecosystem. And so there are a number of ways that we're going to do this. I won't go through them all right now, but one of the important ones for sure is that we are going to be organizing a decarbonization forum summit in the fall here in Ottawa. The intent is to bring members of the ecosystem together and really roll up our sleeves and have a highly interactive engagement to really look at the state of our knowledge and our understanding of what it's going to take to get us to net zero and how electrification is going to contribute to that and what the gaps are in our understanding and how we need to look at the question and advance our research and methods and best practices across different nodes of that ecosystem. So that's taking place the 16th and 17th. Obviously, we'd love you all to come out to that, and more information will be coming on that in the coming couple of weeks as we open up our registration process, et cetera. So in addition to this idea that we've got the ecosystem and we'll be engaging with the members of that ecosystem, obviously we're going to be taking on our own activities. Our staff is going to be doing some interesting work. And so the activity areas that we're pursuing right now, and these will evolve over time as we mature and as the ecosystem builds out. Those activities right now are in 4 broad areas: analytical capacity development, policy analysis, labor and market development, and affordability and equity. I see those as being some of the big issues. Of course, the technologies themselves and how to retrofit, how we can accelerate retrofits, the kind of assemblies, the technical nuts and bolts of how to do this are critical. And there's a lot of work that's happening in the ecosystem on that front. So we're going to have a limited capacity and we're national in scope. So we're less focused on specific technology questions and more focused on the broader areas where we think there are gaps on our flank in terms of the labor availability to do this and the questions of how do people maintain affordability when the gas networks are receding and these kinds of things. So those policy priorities right now are positioned in that way. And if I can I won't go through all of these. A lot of the stuff is cross-cutting because it's still early days. So we have our position paper and we're working on the summit that tries to address all of these activity areas. But in particular on the policy analysis front and on the analytical capacity front, there's a few things that I'd like to share with you that I think are pretty exciting. So for developing analytical capacity, our major focus right now is on the development of a national end-use building decarbonization model. So if we think about the kinds of analysis that are happening on policy broadly across the country, when we think about decarbonization, a lot of the work is being done at a really high level using econometric models, and that provides scenario analysis. The Canadian Energy Regulator, for example, released some scenarios last week that use this kind of high level approach. But if you try to drill in and understand what might that mean for a certain region, or what might that mean for a certain type of heat pump or a certain type of building, it really doesn't do the trick in terms of getting down to that level of detail. And on the other end of the spectrum, we've got lots of work that's happening with utilities to do long-term energy forecasting and planning and potential analyses. But all that work is done at a level of detail and rigor that's maybe too much to consider for national scope. And it's all wrapped up in private models and using utility level data, account level data that we can't access. And so there's a real gap there. And we're building out this model on an open source basis to try to fill that gap so that we can answer a lot of the kinds of questions that people have when we talk about the appropriateness of heat pumps or the impacts on the grid and those kinds of things. I think interestingly, building a model and writing some code is certainly a challenge, and it's interesting in and of itself. But when we really drill into how the alliance and the coalition will function, I think you get into some more interesting sort of aspects. And if you look at the bottom of this kind of picture here, we have the model here that would sit on GitHub and be truly open source and public. But then through the BDA, we'll be able to create some working groups that will work on data access, create working groups that will work on methods analysis. And so bringing in members of the ecosystem who have knowledge in these areas and really putting them to work for this greater good or public service that we've been providing through the model. But importantly, really getting into regional or subsector specific ground truthing or developing real world conditions around input assumptions. So if we create a piece of analysis, we might convene a group of participants from the ecosystem and say, this is the labor forecast for your area that we've employed in this analysis. Is it valid? Do you guys have better or different information about the appropriateness of that? And over time, we'll be able to refine results. And hopefully within not too long, we'll have a really rigorous set of data to be able to query and develop scenarios to inform our decision making. That's one of the big pieces. We're working really hard right now to develop it. And we're hoping to have the first sort of minimally viable product released in the fall at the time of the summit, so we can begin showing people what that looks like. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we're doing that in collaboration with the National Energy Modeling Hub out of HEC Montreal. They've been funded by the Government of Canada to bring together a range of energy-related models, and the building sector is one of those, and we're charged with building that. On the policy front, obviously, there's a lot of different aspects to this. If you think of code acceleration, or if you think of recommendations for national level funding, or if we think about green building standards at the municipal level, there's so much activity in this space, and we're helping and trying to contribute to that, first by releasing our position paper that kind of lays out what we think the issues are and where the challenges lie, and we hope, as I mentioned, to engage on that. But we're also working with others in the space, other civil society organizations like Efficiency Canada and the Climate Institute, on a couple of other initiatives. The next one that we're working on is a document on, or a research piece on, air conditioners and what would happen to those at the end of their life. What would it look like if we replace those with heat pumps to offset not only the cooling, but also the heating. So that'll be coming out. But also we're looking to form various working groups. One of them is a sort of a decarbonization policy working group where we can meet with others in the space who are doing interesting research, compare our research calendars, identify gaps in research questions, and in one way or another, try to do a little bit of coordination so that we can make best use of our limited resources in that regard. So those are some of the immediate things that we're working on the policy front. As I mentioned a couple of times, I think the idea is to have all of these partners within the ecosystem coming into the fold. We hope to continue attracting members of a building ecosystem over the coming years and to really build this out. And the idea would be creating opportunities for people to collaborate on issues that are important to them. We've identified a few in our position paper as a humble offering to say this is where we think some of the issues are. But of course, members in the ecosystem will have lots of questions themselves, and the potential for researches and additional activities and pilot projects and those kinds of things can be vast. So we intend to create various functions over time. Some of these are already forming with respect to the model. Those are already gelling into space and time, and we hope that by the fall we have those formed, as well as this policy sort of working group established across the country. But there's going to be others as we continue to unfold our mandate and continue to get the word out and build out the partners. So far, we announced our formation in April, and we're at about 80 partners now. Again, it's a very wide cross-section of ecosystem builders, installers, manufacturers, and others, banking and finance, and others in the space. So we're really pleased with the response to date. Of course, we'd like to amass as many partners as we possibly can. So, we're trying to get the word out, obviously, and doing that. We are funded primarily through philanthropy right now and through contribution agreements with the federal government, such as NRCan, and really thankful for that. We are not charging fees to become a partner of the organization. That's free. And the intent is that it will remain free. It's not to say we'll never ask for money. We're looking at various models to fund research and various activities. And the concept of having a research trust or a research fund that we would bring together by passing the hat around through the partnership is definitely on the table and something that we'll be looking to roll out later. And we're guided by just an amazing steering committee. You can see that the organizations here, including Efficiency Canada, of course, who's been very instrumental in our formation and our guidance over the last several months. We'll try to wrap it up, but real quick, at the risk of getting sales pitchy, obviously we're talking about collaborating and we're talking about doing work together. It's going to be a big ecosystem, and the working groups will get launched and they'll take on a life of their own, is what our hope is, and really delve into the issues that are important to the participants. But a lot of it is information sharing. It's about us creating a federal platform for regional organizations or for local organizations to represent the interests of this movement to the federal government. But very importantly, this idea of regional coordination or subsector validation, whenever we create research, being able to reach out to the community and say, hey, what do you think? Is this good? Is it bad? Do you have different data? Do you have better data? What are you hearing on the ground? How's it working in your community? That'll be the real, I think, where the rubber meets the road and where we can really distinguish ourselves once we've got a certain sort of critical mass to all of this. There's lots of things we'll try to do. We'll have a program that's exciting for the partners that come on board. We're going to do quarterly calls and updates and information sharing among the group and peer networking and learning opportunities. The working groups will be formed as lots of opportunities for professional development and staying abreast of the latest issues through that kind of collaborative space that we're creating. We'll try to send out research early so people get a sneak peek and can be prepared to respond and be prepared to amplify through their own networks. And of course, we think associating with us over time as we demonstrate our value and worth will bring in brand benefits for sure. I think that's going to be true as we move forward. Super easy to do, very low hurdle in terms of coming in. We have you review our charter that states what we're trying to do, a lot of the same information that you would have seen here in this presentation. And then we basically have you sign off on that. And once you're in the fold, we can begin communicating with you and including you in our partner communications and things like that. I think that's most of what I have to say. I'd love to open the floor up to our questions. All right.
I think I can see John in the background saying if anybody wants the slide deck, they're welcome to have it. So
Nice.
It looks like you've put the email address for the Building Decarbonization at the bottom there. I would just say if we don't get to your question today, or if you want to speak to John or to Brian or to their Director of Research, Matthew, then reach out through that email address. They're welcoming, I know, questions, feedback, pretty much anything at this point. Yeah, we can get to some of the questions that were asked in the question and answer box. So if you do have any questions for Brian, feel free to put it in right now or go ahead and like some of the questions that are in there. So let's just talk about the summit that you were mentioning it was October, right? In
Yes.
Ottawa. So Tracy's wondering if you're inviting the C40 cities to the summit.
The C40 cities, the invitation is open to anybody that wants to participate. It's going to be public. It's not just our members. And as the word gets out, we're welcome to have anybody come along that has an interest in pursuing our objectives.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, I kind of want to start with a bit of an existential question here, and I think this is a really good point, and this is something that we're grappling with in Canada right now. Kai was mentioning the state of the electricity grid and the source of energy for our electricity at this point. So how is that incorporated into the business model, into the research you're doing? Because we know that electrification is not enough. We know that electrification is not a silver bullet. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great question. And there's a real risk in coming across and being flippant and saying, yeah, we just electrify, it's a piece of cake. In our position paper, we're really clear that there are a lot of challenges. One of the challenges is the grid. Not only is it just the overall ability to generate enough electricity, but also the question of peak management. And so these are not concerns that we take lightly. They're obviously, probably the grid question is the biggest concern that we have. But our contention is that if you look at all the alternatives, if we need to get to a net zero future where there is no unsequestered combustion of fossil fuels, notwithstanding the challenges in building out the grid, electrification is still the most promising avenue to get there. We know that RNG is a potential solution can have good contributions, but it's not sufficient. There just isn't enough of it. There isn't going to be enough of it. And moreover, when you look at a whole of economy approach to the question, there are other areas that may need the RNG more than the building sector does, knowing that we can actually get through heating and cooling with heat pumps and with electrification. And so it's not to dismiss the challenge, it's a real challenge. Our contention is that we have to really look closely at other technologies like peak load flexibility, I guess is the catch-all term. Utilities are working hard to implement smart grids to allow better management of the peak. At the building level, heat pumps are not sufficient as the only technology. We also need to bring in load flexibility, load control, peak demand management approaches. And of course, it's Efficiency Canada. We can't talk about this without talking about energy efficiency. Where it's possible, people really need to make their buildings as efficient as possible so that the heat pumps that are going in can be appropriately deployed and have the right size to manage without overburdening the grid unnecessarily. So it's a complex question for sure. When you look at the alternatives, anywhere we look, there are challenges that are equal or greater than the grid issue on alternatives to electrification. So we still think electrification is the best bet going forward, the most no regrets place to put your chips, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I think Efficiency Canada works within a vast network of a bunch of environmental and policy advocacy organizations, think tanks, and we understand that challenge as well and the opportunities in electrification. And I think that's why there is a big focus on electrification right now, because it is a space where maybe there isn't enough advocacy or hasn't historically been enough advocacy. So I think this is a push to fill that space as well. Whereas I think there is a lot of subsidies. Working in Alberta, we do not have a clean grid here. I know this firsthand, and I just came from Nova Scotia. So there's a lot of subsidies to help the companies decarbonize, and especially when it comes to both technology and the mechanics of the operations.
Yeah, and if I can, it's one of the reasons why we need to build out this model and increase our analytical capacity, because we have a tendency very much to extend linear thinking to this is how it is now. And so if everybody did this and we move forward in the current system, this is what it would look like. And on the grid issues, our analysis shows that if the Alberta grid does decarbonize by 2035, which is intended to with the currently proposed legislation, even today, if you install the heat pump over its life, it would still be reducing overall carbon emissions rather than moving forward in the status quo. Now that depends on the grid decarbonizing, but that is the intent right now in our current policy landscape. So with the analytical tools that we're building, we hope to be able to more easily and more quickly talk about what happens if that isn't the case. What happens if the grid is delayed by 5 years? Then what is the guidance? What is the appropriate sort of policy environment? And so it's really highlighting the kinds of gaps in our knowledge that we hope to be able to fill, because the questions are just really complex when you start looking at the intricacies and the details, especially regional considerations are very important.
Absolutely. So we've got a couple questions about different types of energy and energy systems. And one question was about the place for renewable energy, and one is about the role of district energy systems, especially with bioenergy, carbon capture storage, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So did you want to speak to that? Yeah. We're getting a little bit broader.
Well, no, that's great. No, that's great. But that's amazing. That's the nature. It's the nature of the debate. And so there's a few things that I can say on renewables. On the supply side, we need as much renewable energy as possible. We trust and hope that others are advocating for, as strongly as we're advocating for electrification in buildings, we really hope that others in the space are also advocating for renewable energy on the supply side, whether it's behind the meter or on the grid. It's not a mutually exclusive question at all. We absolutely need more sources of renewable energy in Canada. It's really getting cheap and it's very competitive. So I hope that can be taken for granted in our discourse. If it's not, we can try to make that more clear. On the other technologies, like our analysis shows that there's a long way to go on a lot of these other tools, carbon capture and storage, especially on a distributed basis, like each building, those kinds of things. If we have questions about the capacity for electrification to do the job, then the questions on the capacity of those other technologies to do the job should be really a lot higher. Those are way less certain. They're way less proven technologies. We're not saying that there's no place for them, but what we are saying is it's for others to demonstrate that those technologies are going to come and rise to the occasion, given the depth of the challenges that we have. And of course, if we're able to see a pathway to deploying those technologies at the scale required, or on a regional basis where it's appropriate, where the grid may not be able to decarbonize others, those are perfectly acceptable solutions. But our contention is that as a pathway to get us to net zero by 2050, probably notwithstanding the success of those other approaches, electrification is still going to be the vast majority of what we need to get done. Let's say it's 60% or 70% of what needs to get done. We still have a long row to hoe in order to accelerate the market transformation and get the number of heat pumps into the system as required. We're trying to take a bit of a balanced approach, but unapologetically also saying these other concepts and ideas about how to get there are probably less certain on balance. And if you look at the TA's pathways reports, it demonstrates the decision-making framework that leads us to that decision-making. Not to say it's off the table, but we'll let others advocate for that and on an evidence-based approach, show us how it's going to work and how we're going to get there.
Absolutely. Thanks. Okay, Jonathan had a question about the business case for private sector entrepreneurs in an open space environment. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm assuming that it's about the open source model and how that's going to work and look. So I think that the open source model is probably more of a decision-making tool that's going to be applied more at a national level and apply more to policy analysis and decision-making policy advocacy. It'll probably be less relevant to practitioners that are on the ground for sure. But that doesn't mean to say that people won't be able to find interesting information there. We hope to have lots of visualization tools and scenario analysis that might demonstrate that for the area of jurisdiction of a small company or developer or a builder, to help add another data point to the idea that the business case is strong to move forward on this, that the market is there, that we have momentum toward these technologies ramping up. And I think that there are definitely different users that are going to make use of analyzing scenarios and really delving into the deeper research questions. And that may not be private sector organizations, but the overall sort of presentation of the data and the communications and information that'll flow from that, I think will still be very useful in helping to justify the business case and to demonstrate that this is probably where the puck is going. So we should invest in this and we should spend time and energy positioning ourselves and getting ourselves ready for this new market opportunity.
Thank you. Okay, so I think this is a really relevant question, and I think you alluded to this through your presentation. So how is the BDA leveraging and considering the working groups and efforts that are currently occurring across the country? How can those of us in the sector help ensure we're not reinventing the wheel of work that has been done?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can't say that we have a pat answer for that. In a lot of ways, we're arriving on the scene. I said it before, I'll say it again, with great humility. I've been working in the space for 30 odd years. I understand how much good work is already happening. We're not the be all and end all. We're not displacing anybody. And we really recognize that a big part of our work is just getting caught up and reaching out to people and understanding what is going on. And our Director of Stakeholder Engagement, John Perkis, is very keen to hear from people who are working on things, to cause us to plug in together and just compare notes on what we're working on. And our objective is really to find gaps and to work to complement the stuff that's already going on. It's super counterproductive to duplicate efforts. So if anything that I've said during the presentation raises a concern or a question in anyone's mind, absolutely reach out if you've got something amazing going on. Not only do we not want to duplicate it, but we want to tell the story about what you're working on and get the word out there that this is already happening, and maybe actually help bridge connections with other nodes of the network, whether it's some other subsector in the ecosystem. So the intent is really not to duplicate. And I guess also I can add, I put it back to whoever's asking the question or to anybody on the call today. We have a new opportunity. This ecosystem approach in the Canadian landscape hasn't really been deployed in the building sector yet. We're a very disaggregated sector. We have practitioners operating in different elements of the space. So really think about how can we leverage the idea that through one organization, you might be able to reach into the BDA and back out to banking and finance, or back out to a developer, or back out to a manufacturer through the working groups that we'll be putting in place. So I think there's a great opportunity. Definitely want to try not to duplicate efforts. Might be hard at the beginning. And if we step off the beaten path and onto somebody's toes, we definitely want to know about it. And we want to try to work collaboratively and in complementary ways.
And I think because I can see who's on the call and I know this is our network that we're talking to. I also wanted to mention that I think we've been a recipient of that goodwill and the intent to collaborate. So John and I have talked quite a bit. And I think to partially answer that question as well, there is some benefit in understanding the broader narrative and who's part of that broader narrative, and also helping to share each other's work. Efficiency Canada is also doing work in this space, as none of you should be surprised to hear. As we build out our section of the website for this, we're trying to figure out ways that we could incorporate the different reports that are coming out that actually build on this narrative, all knowing that we're working towards an end goal of reaching emissions reductions and building decarbonization. So I think when you have that broader goal in mind and understand that we're all working towards it, as we're working together, trying to leverage each other's work and leverage the networks to get these pieces in front of policymakers and try to help them make better decisions, that's certainly, I think, the direction that we're all heading in. And there is that intent to work collaboratively. So if you haven't been part of that conversation and you do want to be part of that conversation, you can reach out to me, you can reach out to John. You can reach out to the Canadian Climate Institute. There are a number of people at Pembina Institute. I think we're all connected enough that there's an opportunity to see where leveraging can happen.
Absolutely. And I think there's real power too in having networks of networks. The ability to have different organizations collect interested parties for slightly different reasons creates a tapestry that is really compelling. And I think if we think about what's happening with the green building strategy right now and it's the delays, et cetera, like having certainty, demonstrating that the industry has our decision makers' backs and that we're creating cover for progressive policies to happen is just really critical. And we come at it very much with that mindset. And again, like with great humility, recognizing how much good work is happening and trying really hard to create that cohesive picture that there is a consensus that we need to move in this direction and that we probably really ought to do it a heck of a lot more quickly than we're currently doing it if we're ever to succeed. We're so far behind. And so the urgency is quite high.
Absolutely. So I'm just looking at the time and we do have other questions in the chat, and unfortunately we're not going to have time to get to them today, and I'm sorry about that. But as mentioned, the email address is at the bottom of the screen here. I want to thank you, Brian, for joining us today. It was really informative to understand the work that BDA is doing, where you're headed. I really encourage everybody to read the position paper. I think that lays it out really clearly as well. So thank you so much for joining us. And then I'll just do a bit of housekeeping before we all walk away.
Well, thank you as well. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much, Alison. You've been great and very helpful.
Thank you. So a couple things to mention. This session has been recorded. As Brian mentioned, the slide deck is available if you'd like it. We are going to break for the summer after this. So this is actually the last session of spring summer. So there will be no sessions in July. There will be no sessions in August. We will come back together in September. So September 8th, we've got Yasmin from Empower joining us, and she's going to talk about the direct install program that was just launched in Calgary and share some lessons learned from that. So I'm really excited about that. And then the second session we'll be hosting in September will be about our heat pump Mythbusters. In July, we will be releasing a heat pump Mythbuster, and it basically brings together all of the research around heat pumps and definitely some of the misinformation that's being shared. We're working with media to try to correct that. We're working with policymakers. There's going to be a couple of really exciting pieces come out over the summer. Brian was mentioning there's a piece around what happens if we switch all air conditioners to heat pumps. And that's something that the government, whether provincial or federal government, can work to act on really quickly that would start to ramp this up quite quickly, and even going beyond the Greener Homes grants that we know are in existence right now. I also, before we break today, knowing that there are some other players in this area, wanted to mention the report that the Climate Institute of Canada just released. So they released a report talking about how clean electricity is affordable electricity. I'm basically saying that Canadians will spend 12% less on energy than they do today when they switch off of fossil fuels. So they were studying like what electrification would do for costs of electricity. And so I encourage everyone to read that report too. So eventually we will all have this on a webpage where we're seeing this narrative and all the work everyone's doing in this space. And I encourage you to sign up for updates, whether it's to BDA or Efficiency Canada, to see when these pieces are coming out and see how you can get involved in this if you're interested and this is something that is important to you or your business. So thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And we will see you in September. Happy Friday and happy summer again, everybody. Take care.
Thanks so much, everyone.